Because Chatham House has always led the way in shaping new thinking on Britain's place in the world. And with the general election less than 2 weeks away now, I thought there was no better place to come and set out my case. And I want to set out a case on how I will seek to reshape our great country's relationship with our allies and our partners, and how Britain can play its role in overcoming the great global challenges that we face. Now, my argument to you today is a simple one. The next Labour government will stand up for Britain and ensure that our country takes a strong and confident place on the world stage. It's time to reject the small-minded isolationism that I believe has characterised this government, because I believe it is an approach that has shrunk our influence and weakened Britain. We need a government that is outward-looking, not inward-looking, optimistic about our role in the world, not pessimistic. But just as we should learn from the mistakes of this government, so too we should learn from our past too, including the 2003 Iraq War, recognising that we are always stronger, more effective, and have more authority when we work with allies across the world and seek to strengthen, not weaken, multilateral institutions. So standing up for Britain, speaking out for Britain, and using Britain's influence in cooperation with our allies, that's the essence of the foreign policy of the government that I hope to lead. And that's the approach I want to lay out for you today. Now, I know my first responsibility as Prime Minister will be to keep our country safe, because the threats we face are real, and I want to say something about them. But they're threats here at home and indeed abroad, from nuclear proliferation to ISIL, to Russia and Ukraine, to the changing balance of power between East and West, to the ongoing national security challenge that I believe climate change represents, to the terrible and heartbreaking scenes we've witnessed in the Mediterranean this week. These challenges reflect powerful global trends that any government, Labour or Conservative, must now confront. Forces that shape the world in which we all live. And I want to describe three of the trends that I think underlie what we see in our world. The first concerns the very complexity of the global challenges that confront us. Because as we all know, and as this audience would know better than most, the threats we now face are not generally the old threat from single states. They cross borders and boundaries, and they are more complex than the deeply dangerous but more traditional interstate rivalry of the past. It's true, of course, of ISIL, motivated by an evil ideology that recognises no borders, but of course wants to establish a state of its own. It's true of the mass migration caused by conflicts that stretch across entire regions, especially in North Africa and across the Middle East. And it's true of climate change, which threatens the future of everyone no matter where they live. All of these aren't traditional forces that we face. And what I take from that is it means that they can't effectively be confronted by any single state acting on its own. Not the United States, not China, not the United Kingdom, no country on their own. They can only possibly be tackled by concerted action by countries working together all around the world.
Good afternoon, everyone.
But it's not just the complexity and transnational nature of the challenges we face that matters. The second trend means that we confront them at a time when the very institutions that we might rely on to help us confront those forces are themselves under more strain than they've been for generations. From the EU to the UN, the multilateral institutions that were crafted after the Second World War face more serious pressure than they have known before, both from outside their institutions and from within them, with their reputation in part undermined by the challenge of a series of global crises to which they appear to have not been able properly to respond. From Iraq, more than a decade ago, to Syria today, to the continued stalemate in the search for peace between Israel and the Palestinian people, as well as the continued belligerence of states that seek to undermine the international order that these institutions are precisely designed to uphold. And then there's a third trend, as if this wasn't difficult enough, there's a third trend that makes things more difficult still. Because we live now at a time not only when international institutions are losing support, but when individual states themselves also find it harder to act. So many countries around the world are faced by serious budgetary constraints in the aftermath of the financial crisis, meaning their capacity and willingness to respond internationally has been dimmed. And others are undermined by deep and persistent struggles within their own population. For example, rightful demands for greater democracy, greater accountability, and greater equality, destabilizing old orders without straightforwardly leading to stable reform. So in 2 weeks' time, any government will be facing the same challenges, some of the challenges that I've laid out. Threats which cross boundaries, international institutions under strain, states in all parts of the world facing difficulties of their own. Now, these global trends are unavoidable, that's true. But the crucial truth we must acknowledge is that the difficulty Britain faces in navigating this new global order, I believe, is being made far worse by decisions that our own government has made. My case is that David Cameron has presided over the biggest loss of influence for our country in a generation. And that has happened because the government he leads has stepped away from the world rather than confidently towards it. And I want to set out what I mean. Because I believe it's an approach that has shrunk our influence and weakened Britain. And the evidence for that is all around us. Take the situation of Russia and Ukraine. Was there ever a more apt symbol of Britain's isolation and waning influence than when David Cameron was absent as the leaders of Germany and France tried to negotiate peace with President Putin? And we've seen it this week with regard to the crisis unfolding in the Mediterranean. In Libya, Labour supported action to avoid the slaughter and stop the Gaddafi regime, the threats they made to Benghazi. But since the action, the failure of post-conflict planning has been obvious. David Cameron was wrong to assume that Libya was a country whose institutions could simply be left to evolve and transform themselves. What we've seen in Libya is that when tensions over power and resource began to emerge, they simply reinforced deep-seated ideological and ethnic fault lines in the country, meaning the hopes of the revolutionary uprisings quickly began to unravel. The tragedy is this could have been anticipated and it should have been avoided. And Britain could have played its part in ensuring the international community stood by the people of Libya in practice rather than standing behind the unfounded hopes of potential progress only in principle. Now, by far the most important cause of our loss of influence is the position of this government, I believe, in regard to the European Union. With the threat of an in-out referendum on an arbitrary timetable, with no clear goals for their proposed European renegotiation, no strategy for achieving it, and a governing party riven with internal divisions over our future in the EU, including a foreign secretary who has actually openly advocated leaving the European Union. Now, I've just got to be candid with this audience, and we've seen it actually confirmed again by HSBC today. I think all of this poses a grave risk to Britain's position in the world. Of course the European Union needs to change. There are demands for it to change in almost every other member state, on immigration, on benefits, on the rights of national parliaments. And Britain should be leading the process of reform. But this government's approach to Europe means that even when Britain's interests are shared by other member states, EU leaders are reluctant to support us. In part because they think we have one foot already out of the door. That is bad for Britain. And our loss of influence in Europe leads to a further loss of influence in the world, from the United States to China. Here's what I think is the central case. We are stronger as a leading partner in the European Union, and we are weaker when we are not. I think one of the profound mistakes of Euroscepticism is to believe that we are somehow more influential with others if we depart the EU, when in fact the opposite is true. It is precisely our influence within the EU which makes us more influential in the world. That's what people in China say, that's what people in the United States say. Now, I think that none of this needed to be the case. In fact, the great irony of this situation is David Cameron says he wants us to stay within the European Union. He's pursued his strategy not because of any great political principle or ideal, because he says he believes in staying in the European Union. He's done it because he's been pushed there by political forces in his own party and by his fear of other political parties in our country. The rise of conservative Euroscepticism and UKIP has led him to this position. He's taken us to the edge of European exit because he's been too weak to control his own party and too anxious about the rise of UKIP, a rise he should have challenged but pandered to instead. And these problems have worsened dramatically, I've got to say to you, in the last few weeks. Because worried about losing power, the Conservatives are now trying to do everything they can to talk up the prospects of the Scottish National Party and pit English nationalism against Scottish nationalism. Now let me be clear, this is incredibly dangerous for our country. We shouldn't be turning one part of the UK against another. We should be standing up for the whole of the United Kingdom. We shouldn't be sweeping away what binds us together in favour of emphasising what drives us apart, or trying to obscure the real issue of this election, the kind of country we want to be at home and abroad. See, I believe the real task for Britain is not to divide between one nation and another, but to build a United Kingdom that works for all. Now, what's the link between these two issues? I think there is a link. A country that is working for people at home is a country that can be more confident abroad. And that is the kind of Britain that I believe in. And that is the kind of Britain that Labour believes in. A Labour Party that believes we should be proud and confident as to what our country can achieve in the world. And let me just say something now about this. We are and will continue to be one of the most capable global powers. What do I mean by capability? I mean we have the world's 5th largest defence budget, the 2nd largest aid budget, and the 4th largest diplomatic network in the world. And we have the skills and the people able to deliver for Britain in the years ahead. Our military personnel who have served us so bravely in the conflicts of the last decade. Diplomats around the world, and I'm not just saying this because I'm at Chatham House, who are some of the best and brightest men and women serving any country in the world. The unparalleled reach and impact of the BBC World Service and our journalists. Now, with such talent and reach, there is no reason for Britain to shrink from the world.